In today's video, we're covering the 6 fatal ways tourists died on a vacation abroad. From a confrontation with a quiet local in a Medellin bar gone wrong, to a man stepping into monsoon floodwater, only to be met with a shocking, deadly surprise. It was June 14, 2016. The warm evening air in El Poblado, Medellin's upscale nightlife district, carried sounds of laughter and Latin music through cobblestone streets. Within hours, those same streets would absorb the blood of a tourist who mistook bravado for safety in a city where disrespect carries consequences far more permanent than embarrassment. Darian Kolst was a 29-year-old warehouse logistics supervisor from Boise, 2 weeks into a solo South America trip following a difficult breakup. Back home, co-workers knew him as someone who often got drawn into weekend bar arguments, pushing boundaries even when it wasn't wise. He wasn't particularly aggressive by nature, but alcohol loosened whatever restraint he possessed. Friends described him as someone who tested limits without understanding when to stop. This trip was meant to help him reset and move forward. Darian had arrived in Medellin 3 days earlier, drawn by nightlife and adventure tourism. He spent his evenings hopping bars, drinking steadily. At a popular third stop with outdoor seating, staff noticed him focusing on a quiet local man. El Poblado's upscale bars often operate under local codes of respect enforced by territorial groups, and public disrespect can provoke serious, unexpected consequences. Darian began loudly mocking the man's appearance and clothing, holding his phone toward him while making exaggerated gestures. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably. Security approached Darian twice, asking him to settle down. He complied temporarily, but returned to his target minutes later. When the bar closed his tab and asked him to leave, security escorted him out the front entrance but allowed him to remain on the public sidewalk. Darian went outside and waited on the sidewalk. The local man emerged minutes later. Darian immediately confronted him, shoving his shoulder and calling him a coward while his phone recorded. The man said nothing, instead stepping away toward a parked sedan and making a brief phone call. His body language remained calm, almost resigned. Darian continued shouting, attracting attention from outdoor diners at adjacent restaurants. The man finished his call and walked slowly down the block, disappearing around a corner. Locals saw Darian laughed and turned back toward the bar entrance. A few minutes later, a motorcycle approached without headlights despite the street being illuminated only by bar signs and patio lighting. The passenger dismounted while the engine continued running. Several outdoor diners seated less than 15 feet away reported hearing 2 rapid gunshots. The shooter held his weapon at chest height, firing twice into Darian's upper left chest at close range. Darian collapsed backward, his head striking the curb with audible force. Blood spread immediately across the concrete, pooling beneath his shoulders and running into the gutter. The motorcycle departed within seconds. The man Darian had confronted never reappeared. Witnesses remained frozen, several dropping to the ground instinctively. A bartender pulled Darian partially out of the street to avoid traffic, while a restaurant manager called emergency services. Police arrived in 6 minutes, paramedics 9, finding no pulse or respiration and severe chest trauma. Resuscitation was halted on scene. The medical examiner later ruled death from 2 close-range gunshots to the upper left chest, penetrating the heart and left lung, causing catastrophic internal bleeding and cardiac arrest. Investigators reviewed nearby private security camera footage from surrounding bars and restaurants, but the investigation produced no arrests. Darian's family held a small funeral in Boise with minimal attendance. It was July 22, 2015. The late afternoon sun beat down on the crowded resort town of Magaluf, Spain, where thousands of tourists packed budget hotels lining the strip. At one mid-range property facing a central courtyard pool, guests gathered on their balconies to watch an organized foam party below. Among them was Graham Kelton, a 34-year-old regional sales representative from Birmingham, England, standing beside his 19-year-old daughter Elise on their 4th-floor balcony. Elise wasn't a reckless young woman. Her university tutors described her as cautious and rule-following, the kind of student who reminded classmates to walk in the hallways. This trip marked her first time abroad as an adult, a reward Graham had promised after she'd completed her first year of university with distinction. He'd saved for 8 months to afford the week-long package holiday for his family of 4, selecting this hotel specifically for its pool amenities and family-friendly reputation. That afternoon, his wife was napping in the room with their younger son, while Graham joined Elise on the balcony to watch the entertainment below. The balcony was about 6 feet deep with a 36-inch concrete railing, below the 43-inch height standard common in much of Europe. Multiple guests from across the courtyard later confirmed Elise had climbed up, so her feet rested on the flat top edge of the railing, with Graham standing beside her so she could see over the barrier. The courtyard dropped about 40 feet to the pool deck, where foam machines sprayed suds and electronic music blared. The railing's flat top was several inches wide, enough for a person's shoes to rest if they stepped up. Witnesses reported Elise shifted her weight forward suddenly, attempting to wave at friends she recognized from the pool earlier. As she twisted her torso, her feet balanced on the rail and sunscreen slick on her arms. Graham reached for her, but his grip never fully caught. His hands had been positioned at her side rather than around her torso, and as she leaned forward, his fingers slid past her. For a fraction of a second, her body teetered on the outer edge of the railing before she tipped forward over the side. A single scream cut through the music. Several witnesses later disagreed whether it came from Elise, her father, or someone on the pool deck, partially drowned by the sound system below. She fell face first, rotating slightly in the air. The 40-foot fall lasted only a moment. She struck the concrete pool deck head first and sustained catastrophic cranial trauma incompatible with life. A German tourist seated poolside reached her within seconds. Severe head trauma was immediately visible. Her limbs remained motionless. Bystanders reported no observable breathing. Hotel staff arrived within 30 seconds and attempted CPR, while another employee called emergency services and instructed staff to lower the music. They continued resuscitation efforts until paramedics arrived. Graham descended the interior stairwell barefoot, pushing through gathering crowds. His wife's screams from the balcony above became audible once staff cut the music. Hotel reception contacted emergency services immediately. Spanish paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. After assessment, medical personnel determined the injuries were incompatible with life and pronounced Elise deceased at the scene. Death was determined instantaneous upon impact. Spanish authorities investigated and ruled the incident a tragic accident, finding no criminal negligence. The public prosecutor's office ordered a routine forensic review, and municipal inspectors examined the balcony structure for code compliance. The hotel installed additional warning signage about balcony railings within the week. Graham's family returned to Birmingham 3 days later. It was October 3, 2017. The coastline stretched along Cinque Terre's cliffside paths, where centuries of foot traffic had carved roots into stone above steep seaside cliffs. Nolan Vierek, a 33-year-old IT support technician from Des Moines, Iowa, stood at a metal barrier blocking the trail between Vernazza and Monterosso, deciding whether to turn back or continue. Nolan had saved for 2 years to afford this solo trip through Italy. His co-workers said that he'd mapped his hiking route weeks in advance, studying trail difficulty ratings and scenic viewpoints. This coastal path was supposed to be the highlight of his trip, a relatively easy walk with stunning ocean views. Nolan had hiked Iowa's modest trails regularly, building stamina on flat Midwest terrain that bore no resemblance to Mediterranean cliffs. That morning, heavy rain from the previous evening had left portions of the trail unstable. Local authorities had posted closure signs and erected barriers at multiple access points. Coastal trails carved into cliff faces become treacherous after storms, as water saturates the shale and limestone, reducing friction and destabilizing rock formations that can remain precarious for days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, 2 Australian hikers watched Nolan climb around the metal gate. He stepped onto the narrow trail where loose shale covered the path, slick with moisture. Below, waves broke unevenly against rocks in lingering post-storm swell. Nolan moved carefully at first, testing his footing on the incline that hugged the cliff face. The specific section between Vernazza and Monterosso rises about 700 feet above sea level, with steep drops directly to the Ligurian Sea, where waves break against jagged rocks with force amplified by narrow coastal geography. Approximately 40 yards past the barrier, the ground shifted beneath him. The witnesses heard rocks cracking before seeing Nolan's right foot slide on saturated shale. He dropped to his knees, hands grasping for stability. The vegetation he grabbed, shallow-rooted coastal scrub, tore free from the wet soil. He slid roughly 20 feet down the incline on his stomach, legs flailing for purchase on the disintegrating path. His body struck a protruding boulder with his right temple. The impact produced an audible crack that carried along the narrow inlet to the witnesses above. Nolan's body went momentarily rigid against the rock before continuing downward. He tumbled over the edge, limbs loose and uncontrolled. The fall covered an estimated 70 feet down a rocky slope studded with limestone outcrops. His body struck protruding rocks 3 times during descent, each impact changing his trajectory. One Australian hiker immediately called emergency services. The other maintained visual contact, noting that phone reception was intermittent in the narrow cliff gully. His body entered the water face first with a violent splash, and he showed no movement afterward. He resurfaced briefly, floating face down approximately 15 feet from the cliff base. Small waves pushed him laterally toward jagged shoreline rocks. The witness shouted instructions, but Nolan showed no response or voluntary movement. His body drifted, bobbing with wave action, before lodging between 2 rocks at the waterline. Coast Guard responders reached the scene by boat in about 25 minutes. Constrained by the cliffs and sea conditions, they extracted Nolan from the rocks and transported him to shore. Medical personnel declared him deceased upon arrival. The coroner's examination revealed severe cranial fractures, internal hemorrhaging, and multiple blunt force trauma injuries consistent with cliff fall and rock impact. Italian authorities issued renewed warnings about trail closures. Coverage remained confined to local Ligurian news outlets. Nolan's body was repatriated to Iowa within the week, his solo adventure ending on wet shale above an indifferent sea. It was August 9th, 2014. The afternoon heat shimmered across Kruger National Park's dusty roads, where tourists gathered at a roadside sighting that would soon turn into one of South Africa's most preventable safari deaths. Laurent Demeaux, 41, had saved for 3 years to afford this trip, working overtime at an independent garage in Lyon, where he'd built a reputation for methodical precision. Friends described him as careful with money and calculated in his decisions. They said that this safari represented a dream he'd held since childhood, watching nature documentaries on grainy television sets. He'd arrived in South Africa 5 days earlier, with 2 college friends, following park guidelines meticulously until this moment. That morning, Laurent had been the most cautious of the group, insisting they lock their doors and stay inside the vehicle during every animal sighting. His friends later recalled how seriously he'd taken the safety briefing, even reading the printed rules twice. At 2:45 in the afternoon, their vehicle stopped where several other tourists had parked along the road. A mature bull elephant stood roughly 100 feet away, partially obscured by acacia brush. Laurent's friends remained inside, but something shifted in his judgment. He opened the door and stepped out with his camera, ignoring their urgent protests. Other vehicles stayed sealed, their occupants watching through closed windows. A ranger was visible about 100 yards down the road, but could not intervene immediately. The bull lifted its massive head immediately, its ears spread outward, flaring to full extension in a clear threat display. Within 3 seconds, it charged. Witnesses from adjacent vehicles described the ground vibrating as the elephant charged. The elephant covered the distance with terrifying speed, dust rising behind its pounding feet. Laurent turned toward his vehicle but stumbled on the uneven dirt road, falling forward onto his hands. The elephant struck him with its head, the impact launching him backward onto the dusty road. The bull moved over him, trampling him in a chaotic rush. Witnesses heard a distinct cracking sound as the elephant pressed down with its full weight. His ribs collapsed inward under the elephant's weight. Blood appeared at Laurent's mouth and nose as the elephant trampled him again, this time compressing his abdomen. The force caused severe internal injuries and massive internal bleeding. A final brief stomp crushed his pelvis, and the attack ended within seconds, leaving him incapacitated. The elephant backed away calmly and returned to the brush, showing no further aggression. A tourist called the park emergency line, immediately using the number posted on his dashboard placard. Rangers arrived minutes later, finding Laurent motionless in the dirt. His chest cavity had collapsed entirely, and blood pooled beneath his body. He showed no pulse and wasn't breathing. The attending ranger declared him dead at the scene from massive internal hemorrhaging and multiple organ failure consistent with crush injuries. Park officials issued formal reminders about vehicle exit prohibitions. French media covered the incident briefly in travel sections, focusing on the importance of following wildlife viewing regulations. Laurent's death became another statistic in a long list of preventable safari fatalities. The elephant, behaving naturally in response to perceived threat, was not relocated or destroyed. In Kruger's unforgiving wilderness, one moment of poor judgment transformed a dream vacation into a tragedy that could have been avoided by simply staying inside the vehicle. It was September 18, 2013. The narrow side streets of Beyoğlu, Istanbul, were still alive with late-night foot traffic when Thomas Ebrin made a decision that would lead to his death 5 weeks later. Thomas was a 27-year-old warehouse supervisor from Glasgow, Scotland, visiting Turkey with 2 university friends for a week-long holiday. He worked for a regional logistics company, known among co-workers for his blunt humor and tendency to dismiss medical advice. He'd once worked 3 weeks with a fractured finger rather than visit a doctor. This trip was meant to be simple: cheap hotels, local food, and nightlife. They said that Thomas had no particular interest in Turkish culture or history. He just wanted to drink and decompress after a difficult year managing inventory disputes. That night, the 3 men were walking back to their hostel around 11:45 in the evening. The street was dimly lit, lined with shuttered shops and a few remaining vendors. CCTV cameras mounted on nearby shopfronts provided partial coverage of the street, though their angle missed most sidewalk activity. Stray dogs are ubiquitous in Istanbul, with a large population of stray animals roaming the city's streets and parks. Most are relatively docile, surviving on food left by residents and tourists, but they remain unpredictable, especially when cornered or provoked. A mid-sized, tan-colored dog approached their group, possibly drawn by food smells. Instead of ignoring it, Thomas kicked toward the animal's midsection. The dog recoiled, then lunged forward, sinking its teeth into his lower right calf through his jeans. Witnesses, including a shopkeeper closing his storefront 15 feet away, saw Thomas shout and stumble backward as the dog released and fled down an alley. Blood seeped through the denim rapidly, soaking the fabric within seconds. A nearby pharmacist, hearing the commotion, approached and examined the wound, a deep puncture approximately 1.5 inches long with visible tissue damage. She urged immediate rabies post-exposure prophylaxis at a hospital. Thomas refused, insisting it was minor and he'd clean it at the hostel. His friends supported his decision, wanting to avoid the hassle of Turkish emergency rooms. Little did he know, the bite occurred on his lower leg, where rabies infections can go unnoticed for weeks if untreated. 5 weeks after returning to Scotland, Thomas developed a low-grade fever and tingling sensation radiating from the healed bite site on his calf. Within 72 hours, he experienced difficulty swallowing liquids, followed by throat spasms when attempting to drink water. His flatmate drove him to a regional hospital emergency department on October 28th, where staff immediately suspected rabies upon observing hydrophobia, violent aversion to water. Hospital records documented progressive agitation, excessive salivation, and respiratory distress. Doctors confirmed rabies infection through antibody testing of serum and saliva samples. Turkish health authorities later located and captured a dog matching witness descriptions in the area. The animal, identifiable by unique markings and the absence of the plastic ear tag used to mark vaccinated city dogs, tested positive for rabies virus and was euthanized. Thomas was placed in intensive care and sedated heavily as neurological deterioration accelerated. Despite mechanical ventilation and supportive treatment, the virus had invaded his central nervous system beyond any intervention. He experienced seizures, paralysis, and organ failure over the following week. He died on November 7th, 10 days after hospital admission. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as rabies encephalitis with secondary respiratory failure and multi-organ shutdown. Scottish health authorities issued travel advisory reminders about rabies vaccinations for travelers to endemic regions. The case received brief coverage in regional news outlets, focusing on rabies prevention for travelers. Thomas's family declined to speak publicly. It was July 28, 2018. The monsoon rains had turned a narrow side street near Ongpin Street in Binondo into a shallow river, and beneath the murky water, exposed electrical wiring waited to claim a life that afternoon. Pavel Norek, a 38-year-old procurement specialist from Brno, Czech Republic, had arrived in Manila 4 days earlier for a textile trade expo. He worked for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, specializing in industrial fabrics, and this was his 3rd trip to the Philippines in 2 years. Pavel had a reputation among colleagues for being meticulous with logistics, but adventurous when it came to exploring local markets. His supervisor later mentioned that Pavel often ventured into unfamiliar neighborhoods to source materials directly from small suppliers, believing it gave him better insight into production costs and quality. Despite his usual caution, he sometimes misjudged hazards when rushing between appointments. That afternoon, Pavel was returning from a lunch meeting with a potential fabric vendor when heavy rains flooded the streets. He'd spent the morning at the expo center, but had scheduled meetings with local suppliers in the Binondo area, known for its dense concentration of textile wholesalers. Friends back home described him as practical and confident in navigating foreign cities, someone who preferred walking to taxis when distances were manageable. By 2:15 in the afternoon, the rain had subsided, but standing water remained 6 to 8 inches deep across much of the street. A damaged light post near the intersection had exposed copper wiring hanging approximately 3 feet above the normal street level, now partially submerged in the floodwater. A nearby street vendor had noticed intermittent sparking near the base of the post around 1:30 in the afternoon, but had no way to contact the electrical utility or warn pedestrians effectively. An exposed live conductor was energizing the standing water. Later measurements showed dangerous voltages in the immediate area around the post, creating a hazardous potential across several feet of the flooded street. Pavel approached the flooded section. While attempting to reach the opposite sidewalk, he stepped into the ankle-deep water wearing leather dress shoes, the soles providing minimal insulation against the electrified surface beneath. As Pavel moved forward, he placed his left hand against the metal side panel of a jeepney to maintain balance. Witnesses standing under a nearby awning saw his body stiffen instantly. His arms locked rigid at his sides, fingers splayed and trembling. Current entered through his feet into the water and passed up through his body into the metal side panel he touched, completing a circuit across his chest. Pavel's jaw clenched tight. His entire body convulsed violently for several seconds, muscles contracting involuntarily. His knees buckled, and he collapsed forward into the water, landing face down with a heavy splash. The current continued flowing through his submerged body. A fruit vendor positioned 15 feet away moved toward Pavel, but stopped abruptly after feeling vibration travel up his arm from the water. He stumbled backward, shouting warnings in Filipino. Several pedestrians who had been approaching the flooded area halted immediately. A bystander contacted the local electric utility directly. Personnel arrived and cut power to the entire block approximately 14 minutes after the initial call. Paramedics reached the scene, wading into the now safe water to reach Pavel's body. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest caused by electrical shock, with current traveling through the chest cavity. Burns were present on both feet and the left palm, indicating entry and exit points. The report noted the shock likely induced sudden cardiac arrhythmia. City maintenance crews repaired the damaged light post the following day, installing temporary safety barriers around similar damaged infrastructure throughout the district. Local news coverage was minimal, limited to a brief metro section mention. Pavel's employer issued a short statement expressing condolences and arranged for his body's repatriation to Brno. The textile expo continued without interruption, most attendees unaware that one of their colleagues had died just blocks away. Thanks for watching. If you like these videos, click here.